All right. Looks like we are live, friends.
All right. Greetings and salutations, comic book fans everywhere. Didio has left DC Comics. Is this a time for celebration? I know I'm drinking right now and I got a smile on my face, but maybe I shouldn't. I'm here with my friend Dark Knight Nation. It's Friday night. Hello, Dark Knight. How's it going?
Not bad, man. It's quite the surprise. So I'm glad we get to hop on this headline real quick, and I wouldn't discuss it with anybody else. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me on, my friend.
Well, it's funny. I made that joke to you on Twitter. I actually, Friday afternoon, I was taking it a little bit easy at work, just perusing the web. And I literally I joked because I literally went to the washroom and I came back and I got the notice from you that Dan Didio was gone. And I thought, this must be a joke. It was, you got to be kidding me. But wow, this is truly the end of an era. He was with DC Comics. He's been with DC Comics a long time. And since 2002, and then he got promoted to vice president, executive editor, and then later become co-publisher with Jim Lee in 2010. And there's been a lot of changes with Didio, and he's a guy that has taken the bullet. I think he's taken a lot of bullets for a lot of things that have gone wrong at DC. That's what an editor-in-chief does. It's sort of like being the coach of a hockey team that doesn't do well. I mean, you got to, whether it's your fault or not, you take the bullets. I know I have a love-hate relationship with Dan Didio in terms of what he's done, what I feel is his responsibility, but I also give him credit for some of DC's notable successes. What's your initial reaction, Dark Knight?
Well, it's rough, right? Because as you were saying before, I think that because Dan Didio has such a public platform for DC, I feel like a lot of people tend to give him the blunt of the blame when something bad happens at DC Comics. And I think it's very peculiar because the industry isn't exactly transparent in what the roles behind the scenes are, right? Like, people have a very basic idea of what an editor does. People have a very basic idea of what a writer does, what an artist does, but really there are so many other moving parts to these comic book publishers, and the role of a comic book publisher is different than a publisher of any other medium. And I just find it very not odd, because people do have a tendency to point fingers, but I'm very undecided in how I feel, because Dan Didio has overseen some really bad periods of DC Comics and some really great periods of DC Comics. So for me, I personally have a hard time putting a lot of that same blame on him, just because we don't explicitly know what ideas at DC he's championed, what ideas at DC he's tried to shut down. We don't exactly know what his motives were and what he should be credited for, right? Because it's not like when DC does something huge, they don't say this is the brainchild of so and so, unless it's like a writer or an artist. Mm-hmm. And with Dan Didio, with the news kind of breaking out, I see a lot of creators who I personally respect saying a lot of very positive things about DC when they about Didio, including like Jeff Lemire. Like, one of the things that really stood out to me was that I guess when Vertigo was first on the chopping block, some 10 years ago ish, I guess Didio really championed like Jeff Lemire's Sweet Tooth and keeping things like that rolling. So I think that it's really tough to be in that type of position, especially because he comes off as kind of the most public face of DC. So I think that depending on what happens from here on will determine how I feel about him being fired or whatever happened, being let go, just because I don't think we specifically know what he's again, what he's championed, besides like what we hear about his hate for Nightwing or whatever. So, I'm taking a very middle stance. I don't know exactly what his ideas were, because again, all we hear is random hearsay amongst, other fans.
And I think just for everybody in the chat, I'll be posting randomly your comments, and occasionally we'll comment on them. I know Nightwolf plays. He says, "I don't blame Didio for all the problems at DC, but he still hasn't done a lot of things wrong." And I do think that's true. I will say this, that if you're an editor, it's hard for Dan Didio. It's hard for any editor to essentially, I think, because if you're looking at it from a fan standpoint and a DC standpoint, you can't make all the creators happy and also please your fans. Because look, it doesn't surprise me that Jeff Lemire, who wrote a bunch of obscure titles at one point, was championed by Dan Didio. A lot of those titles never sold. So, but look, if you have your champion, you like the guy, but at the same time, you got to be able to tell your writers and creators, like, he's going to hinder creative freedom at some point. I remember Dan Didio when he first came out, just a quick comment here, that when he first came in, and he was all about, he talked a lot about a story over continuity. And the New 52 was his brainchild. And he championed, just focus on the story. Don't get so hindered with continuity. Well, there's no question that over the last 18 years, whatever continuity that DC had has under Didio's watch, we had 2 to 3 crises. We had Infinite Crisis, we had Final Crisis, we had Convergence. We had, if you believe that there's 7 crises, I think we had 6 of them in the last 18 years, only 1 before Didio came along. And look at the chaos that we have at DC. So it's one thing to give creative freedom to their artists, but at the same time, you got to say, hey, enough is enough. And look, don't even get, we can talk about the abortion that was the attempted rebirth that was supposedly successful, but was overturned by death metal or the darkness that seems to be, infecting the DC universe.
Well, I think that there's such an odd middle ground to take, because even though he was there, we don't necessarily know what the higher powers might have kind of stepped in on and made kind of vetoes about, right? Like, we know the New 52 was his brainchild, and say what you want, I was literally looking over sales numbers today, widely successful. Yeah. The most successful period of DC Comics, at least in the beginning, for a
yes.
long time. Besides DC Rebirth, which again, he was a part of. So I think that blaming him for certain decisions, I know somebody in the chat was explicitly blaming him for DC's problems and for hiring Bendis. I'd challenge you to show me a reputable source that says Dan Didio chaperoned the hiring of Brian Michael Bendis specifically, or whether or not this is just conjecture amongst the fans. Again, I will take a very neutral ground on this, because we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. Well, out of most, and I'll be brief, out of most entertainment industries out there, I think the comic book industry is perhaps the least transparent. So I think it's really difficult for us to kind of try to assign any type of blame to Dan Didio unless there are statements that he has publicly made, or statements that somebody inside the DC offices have made. So that's just me. I don't feel comfortable, being a source of blame to Dan Didio, and I also don't feel comfortable saying that he was the best thing since sliced bread. So I take my judgment with a grain of salt.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Dan, I still say that somebody must like him. The powers that be must really like him. And because at the end of the day, there was a lot of things where, there was even a countdown for the longest time. There were websites that had countdown. They counted the number of days it was since DC Comics screwed up or did something wrong. And the editorial mix-up and the screw-ups at DC Comics were just, it was extraordinary. And throughout it all, Dan kept his job. And I just want to point one thing out. When Rebirth came in, remember Jeff Johns and Dan Didio, they did that YouTube, or they did that video, and before Rebirth came back, and it got a bunch of attention. And then the DC Rebirth one-shot came out, and everyone loved it. DC Rebirth was a phenomenal success. And then at that exact time, that's when Dan Didio became co-publisher with Jim Lee. And I remember asking at the time, and I wasn't the only one, is why is Dan Didio even still there? Isn't that redundant? I mean, it really seemed like a demotion. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, Jeff Johns was, relegated to the wayside. Rebirth seemed to disappear with the advent of metal. And then suddenly, again, Didio was still the spokesperson, and we still had this embracing of darkness. I think, and look, let's have some fun here. Let's speculate. I'm going to speculate, and I'm just going to go out on a limb, and I might be wrong, but hey, the news just broke. I think what happened here, I think with the DC generational line, the DC Generation 1 all the way to DC Generation 5 being the Age of Heroes, I think they're still working out those wrinkles. I don't think any of that stuff's set in stone. Let's not forget that one of the biggest moves in comic book history in the last 10 years was Bendis coming to DC, and it's been nothing but an abject disaster. Let's be honest. Mm-hmm. The sales for Action Comics was 35,000 sales last month for Action Comics. When Bendis came here, and that was, you better believe that was Didio. I mean, that was Didio's brain. I mean, they locked Bendis in there, and it's been a disaster. It's been a disaster. The Wonder Comics line have been a disaster. 7,000 issues were sold of Wonder Comics last month. 6,700 issues of Dial H for Hero were sold last month. Bendis keeps shoehorning them into their stories. Bendis, Event Leviathan. Are you kidding? Non-event. Again, this is Didio's brainchild, and this is when you think of the long list of ups and downs, to cap it off with that catastrophic failure of Bendis, I mean, I'm sorry, but not to mention the loss of Vertigo. Now, I know you can say, well, that's not all on Bendis, but these are some catastrophically bad mistakes that could have been corrected. And I think, hey, at some point somebody's got to take a bullet, and it was about time that somebody took it, and Didio is the appropriate choice.
But I think that what's important to say regarding that is since Dan Didio has been publisher, Jim Lee has also been his co-publisher. So how much of this are we going to take off of Jim Lee just because he is a beloved comic book artist? You know what I mean? I'm not looking to place the blame solely on Didio, because pretty much every initiative Dan Didio has been behind as publisher, Jim Lee is literally his equal. So there's something to question about that. And also, especially with DC Comics being a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, who is to say that some of these initiatives aren't being strung on by executives higher than him through Warner or even at&t that don't know the industry, that are making these mandates? I mean, for Christ's sake, DC 5G is likely branded simply just to get 5G into search algorithms, so that when at&t launches 5G service next year, it has a precedent in the search engine, or in multiple search engines. Yeah. So like the thing is that I don't want to take the blame away from Dan Didio, because I'm sure he's had his fair share of screw ups, but it's also not fair for people to just give him the blame, because people are saying, oh, like example on the screen, Jim Lee doesn't seem to do much. He doesn't seem, you don't know. I don't know. We're not behind the scenes. I mean, clearly Jim Lee must have a major role, because not only is he co-publisher, but chief creative officer. So I just, again, I'm not comfortable solely blaming Didio. I think a lot of people are to blame, because ultimately, like, this is a machine. Right?
Do you think that this is going to have an impact with Maverick commented that if Bendis continues to be there, more Marvel people will go over to DC. Do you think there's any truth, any possibility of that? Do you think that is?
I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think that means as much, because and the thing is, like, you have to look at the perspective of the creators. I mean, first of all, I know, for example, when Donny Cates was going to sign his exclusive, he also got offers from DC, right? He got offered to do Batman after Tom King. We know that for a fact. He has stated this publicly. Do you want to know why he went to Marvel? Because Marvel needed him more, and he could make a bigger splash because there weren't as many huge names. And now look at him. He's like Marvel's next Jason Aaron right now. He's huge. So I think that it really depends on the motive of the creators. With Bendis, you and I have had a little bit of dialogue about what some people are saying about how, Bendis is just taking everything by the balls and doing what he wants to do. Like, I know it sounds like a lot of pre-existing creators at DC weren't satisfied with them letting Bendis take that type of control. So, I mean, I don't necessarily think that with Bendis coming to DC, it means a hell of a lot, because personally, if I were working with Bendis at Marvel and it was one of those situations where I know that the publisher is going to give Bendis the agency to do what he wants to do over what I'm going to do, why would I want to do it? Because I know that there's not going to be much of an impact. Like, sure, he brought some of his friends over. We have Deconic, Fraction. But to be fair, I mean, neither Deconic or Fraction are necessarily like pushing the needle. Like, I feel like to an extent, there's part of them that knows that there's only so much you can do when you know that whatever happens, Bendis can just step over what you're doing.
Yeah, I do think, though, my concern is I think DC is going to benefit from a fresh perspective, a new way of looking at things, or to use a phrase that Dan Didio repeatedly used at every single press junket he ever gave. He always talked about sensibilities, as if that was a word that conveyed anything. It's actually a word that conveys nothing of substance. He's always talked about DC, the reader's sensibilities and the writers. The bottom line is this: DC has lost its identity, and if you don't stand for anything, then anybody can define you. And that's really what's happened here. It's really kind of sad that, I mean, when you talk in theory to, let's say, guys like Kurt Busiek and the old school guys like Mark Waid, Kurt Busiek, all that ilk, Straczynski, they can tell you exactly the difference between DC and Marvel. Mm-hmm. And it's embodied by the JLA versus Avengers teams, and they are decidedly different tones and sensibilities of the two groups, but that difference is being whittled away at. And let me tell you something: you look at what Bendis is, how he's writing Superman. I mean, he's writing it like a Marvel character. I mean, he really is. I mean, he's everything's so decompressed, and he's trying to be so angst-ridden. What's that?
Poorly at that. He's not even doing a Marvel character right. It's poor. I think the decision to fire Dan Didio will be validated or invalidated depending entirely on who they bring in to take that role. Because there's no way that Jim Lee is going to be sole publisher and chief creative officer. So either one of three things is likely to happen, because I don't think they'd fire Jim Lee. Mm-hmm. Either he's going to become sole publisher and they're going to hire a chief creative officer, which I don't think is going to happen. Yeah. They are going to hire another co-publisher, let Jim Lee stay chief creative officer, or they're going to completely hire a sole publisher and bring push Jim Lee to being chief creative officer. And whatever ends up happening next, I think will define whether or not it was a good decision to get rid of Dan Didio. For example, if they said they're naming Jeff Johns co-publisher of DC Comics, I'll jump for joy. I'll sit here and tell you that this is probably the best decision DC's made in the last 3 years. No doubt. But if they bring in some random person from the entertainment industry to become publisher, which is
possibility,
which is a possibility.
Sure.
That would scare me.
Well,
that would scare me a lot.
I guess what would terrify me is I am hoping that one of the reasons why he was finally pushed out was, they looked at what I hope it's because of Bendis. I hope they looked at Bendis, they realizes Bendis is part of the problem. My worst nightmare scenario is if they make Bendis editor-in-chief, or if they give Bendis even more power. That's my worst case scenario.
I'd probably drop everything.
I personally hope, I would love to see, I'm sure, and everybody in the chat, I'm sure, would agree with me. I'd love to see Jeff Johns, even if he's going to come back for 6 months to try to put lipstick on the pig of just to get them started. When Jeff Johns came back for that brief period to talk to each of the creative teams at Rebirth, that Rebirth one should come out. I think we need a little bit of Jeff Johns adrenaline pumping going on, and even if he comes back for 6 months for this next year, have Jeff Johns steer the ship, get him away from his Stargirl CW series. We need another blonde CW series, give me a break. I mean, good grief.
Well,
Like, we don't need another one of those series of, and don't get me started on CW shows, but Jeff Johns, I wish he appreciated that his wheelhouse is comic books. I mean, he's had enough failures in the movies and in TV, as far as I'm concerned. Just maybe pull him back. I mean, he's got Wonder Woman under his belt. Beyond that, I mean, come on, John.
But again, the issues with that are, again, like placing that type of blame on Jeff Johns. I mean, look at the projects where he is specifically given, for example, like writer's credits instead of just executive producer credits, right? I mean, he wrote Wonder Woman. He co-wrote it with Patty Jenkins. Fantastic film. Yeah. And I think that with the CW, I can imagine that he got spread far too thin. I mean, when those shows first started, which is when I'm sure Jeff Johns put more of his focus on those shows, they were great. First couple seasons of Arrow were great. Yeah. First couple seasons of The Flash were great. Excellent television. I mean, I remember for me, I didn't start watching Arrow until like, I think maybe midway through season 2 was like being syndicated on television. And I binged season 1 in 3 days, dude. Like it was different. And a lot of people take issue with how Green Arrow was portrayed, but like in terms of a television show, like completely removing like any concepts of being of fidelity to comics, because that's not what they were going for. They were great. And I think that the projects that there aren't as much intervention on are when Jeff Johns can shine. Because I mean, you look at, all of the things they're blaming him for, Justice League, Suicide Squad, all that shit. All I ever hear about is studio intervention, which leads him to believe Jeff Johns didn't get to do what he wanted to do. I agree with you. I wish Jeff Johns would come back to comics more frequently, because that is his wheelhouse. But I don't think comics were ever his end all be all. I mean, if you look at Jeff Johns' past, he was an assistant to Richard Donner. Like, clearly the guy wants to be a part of film. And I give him a lot of credit for being somebody who can dip their toes into multiple mediums of storytelling.
Well, I'm gonna ask you I'm gonna ask the people in the chat, and I'll ask you, Dark Knight, if you had to pick from a current creator, writer, or artist, or any creative type at DC right now to replace Dan Didio even on an interim basis, who would you pick?
None.
Seriously, none.
I don't trust anybody again besides Jeff Johns. But it's hard to really consider Jeff Johns like a very integral part of.
Well, what about Tomasi or Gleason? You think? I mean, I realize that maybe editorial skills is not in their wheelhouse, but they've got some experience in that department, do they not?
I mean, firstly, Gleason's at Marvel right now. He's signed exclusively to Marvel. Second, no, definitely not Gleason. Tomasi, I would give remote consideration only because he has had very positive experiences working as an editor at DC Comics. Like, I don't know if everybody in the chat knows this, but Tomasi was an editor for DC for quite some time. And he was editing, for example, the Green Lantern books before he hopped on to Green Lantern Corps, and would do occasional writing projects. And I would definitely give him consideration. I think what you and I and everybody in the chat needs to consider is that a publisher needs to have significant experience working in editorial. And no matter how much you like a writer, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the skill set to be an editor, just like how editors don't necessarily always have the skill set to be writers. You know what I mean? And if there were anybody at DC, I would obviously, like, Jeff Johns would be my number one, because publisher has a lot of weight to throw around when it comes to the editorial process at DC, and shaping it. Tomasi, again, I would give consideration to, because he's a great writer. He was a very good editor, has edited a lot of great stuff at DC, including Jeff Johns' Green Lantern run for the most part. But I can't help but think that being a publisher, just that executive role might be a little bit too much for someone like Tomasi.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge step up. Now, if they were to say, we're gonna, because I don't think Jim Lee should be a publisher. I don't. I love Jim Lee. But if anything is proven by his stint at Image, he
Yeah.
doesn't really know story very well. He captures visual narrative and design and aesthetic. Like, he's a master. He's
Well,
one of the best artists.
one thing about Jim Lee, though, is Paul Acosta, he mentioned this more than once. Jim Lee just doesn't seem to work very hard. The guy takes 6 months to do a story. It seems to take him 2 weeks to draw a sketch.
But,
I mean, it's
but
just,
you gotta take into consideration, though, drawing or designing or whatever.
well, what else does he do?
It's not his primary role. He's an executive.
Well, I guess this is part of the ignorance, and frankly, I think this is a job at the PR department. I honestly, obviously, if there's a lot going on behind the scenes, fair enough. I just really, Jim Lee, I don't know what the guy does. I mean, and
that's the thing. As terrible as it is, it's the right choice for the company, because you know what happens if we're busy trying to find somebody to blame that works for them. DC is in the clear, right? Because we're not blaming the company itself for its decisions. We're constantly blaming a figurehead. So as terrible as it is, and as much as that might ruin the reputation of a lot of people, it keeps DC's reputation slightly more intact.
Well, Maverick MX has said, Jim Lee has even said he doesn't want to be head of DC. And that's probably the reason. Who would want to have the headache of being the head of DC Comics right now? There's a comic book culture war we're still right in the middle of it, or at least we're coming out of it. And we're in the middle of a societal, cultural, political, toxic war as it is. We got SJW versus Comicsgate. That's the thing that's not going away. We've got diversity. We got different ways of approaching characters. We got different colors, different everything for all the characters, different stories, different approaches. It is a tumultuous time to be ahead of a comic book publishing company. Let's face it. And it's, you got to wonder, when you got guys like Peter, what is it? The guy from, I'm thinking of an independent publisher, but in any event, it is probably a thankless job, and I would love to be a fly on the wall to know who the top 5 picks are to replace Dan Didio. Because remember, Dan Didio was a wild card. Dan Didio's he had no experience when they hired Dan Didio. He was a producer on Reboot, a show from the 90s or back in the 90s. I played a show called Reboot. It was an old video cartoon, and he had almost no experience. And why they hired him, I have no idea.
Well, he had a lot of creative roles on various animated series. I know that much. But I think the big issue in trying to promote up from DC is that, I just really, again, besides Jeff Johns, I can't think of anybody who I'd want to take the job. And a couple people brought up Grant Morrison, which I think would be an interesting pick. Just because he's so volatile, I don't know if I would necessarily give him that role now. Maybe a couple years ago, yes. But it seems like his focus is more pushing his projects towards Hollywood, which is whatever. That's his prerogative. I think that DC should consider hiring 2 new co-publishers, just to kind of work on that front. In terms of who, obviously Jeff Johns would be phenomenal. I think, moving Tomasi up on an executive level might not be a terrible idea in terms of editorial, but it also takes him away from, putting a pen in his hand to write. Yeah. So that's also, that also scares me a little bit. And I think, again, we need to reconsider the notion that whoever we put into that position has to be more than just a creator we like, right? Just because they have ideas doesn't mean that they're going to be effective at moving pieces on the board when they get behind the room. For example, you're a lawyer. You can have somebody with the best possible ideals and fantastic morals and ethics, but if they can't argue in the court, if they can't present information in a way that they want to present, it doesn't mean they're going to be a good lawyer, right? There's a mediation there. So I think a lot of people are bringing up some really interesting names to take the role. But one thing I want to challenge people to do is to reconsider whether or not you think this person has the acumen or the mentality to move board pieces, because not only are they a part of the creative process, they're essentially executives, which is a whole nother ball game, right? Like one thing we don't talk about in comics is, as much as we want to put out good stories, what is DC Warner worried about? They're worried about selling merchandise. Can this story sell merchandise? I mean, that was one of the biggest reasons why Metal was lit, because look at all the merchandise that could come out of it.
Well, sure, that's part of it, but at the same time, this is about my buddy there, Spike Valentine, he's very he often quotes Kevin O'Neill about talking. Who Kevin O'Neill stated that writers and creators have to realize that they're creators, that they're custodians of folklore. That's what they are. When you're a writer and an artist, you're a custodian of folklore of these characters. And you're also protecting the intellectual property and the source material for the billion-dollar movies that are making Warner's and the MCU a lot of money. And so it is like continuity. Paul Acosta, I got up on the screen, continuity. Bendis don't need no stinking continuity. I mean, there's been a lot of comments alluding to continuity and, the priority, that balance between the continuity and letting the artists do whatever the heck they want, and the writers do whatever they want. That's a gift. That is an art more, but maybe there's a science to it. But you can't just go and be liked by everyone. I mean, it's nice that Dan Didio is liked, but to me, it's that sort of uncomfortable disposition where would you rather be liked and mediocre, or would you rather be ridiculously successful, but maybe, disliked by a couple people? I mean,
you gotta look at it though. It's with him, it seems very split. Like, I know a lot of fans are very happy about this. A lot of creators aren't, but we also know of a couple very high profile creators that do not have a good relationship with Dan Didio. I mean, for example, Ed Brubaker said he would never come back until Didio was gone. Mark Waid said he would never come back until Didio was gone, which kind of interests me. Yeah. Because we talked last week.
I would be up to Mark Waid. I would be up if Mark Waid. They should interview him for editor-in-chief, just for shits and giggles. I would love to see.
He was just named a high position at.
That's right.
At another publisher. I don't quite remember it.
Well, you're right. No, you're right. He was, but nonetheless, Mark Waid. There's too much bad blood with DC, and he's there's always concerns about his mental health issues, and he's sort of a controversial figure. He's kept a lower profile as of late, following that lawsuit he had with I can't remember his name, the other
Comicsgate guy.
Yeah, the Comicsgate guy there, but. It's things are going to get very, very interesting, and I would love to be a fly on the wall in terms of. Dark. Those in the chat who don't know, we've Dark Knight and I did a live stream a couple days or last week on, and we joked and we did it assuming we were DC, the newly appointed DC editors in chiefs, and here we are a couple of days later, and Dan Didio has been let go, or he's left. We're not sure what it is, and it's just kind of funny. And we're waiting for our phone call because I think it's only appropriate, because I would happily take over the reins from Dan Didio, because I can state with virtual certainty that I know I couldn't possibly do as bad a job. I would have to try.
Yeah, I mean, the really interesting thing, obviously, is what is going to happen moving forward, both in whoever gets hired and what ends up happening with kind of like the universe and the initiatives publishing wise. Look at DC though. I mean, they've been super in terms of like the holding positions. They've been super volatile. I mean, we've literally had two handfuls within the last couple of months of people in the kind of editorial positions that are, whether or not they've been let go, fired, finding new positions, who have been scattering away from DC. And it makes me wonder what that means. I mean, granted, some of those people in editorial are people that personally I'm not fond of their work. So is it a good thing? Is DC making a positive step and purging their company of people who, have been inhibiting it in some way?
Maybe they are, but I have at least one vote. Thank you, Nightwolf, for yes, give it to Comic Boom. That would be wonderful. I will happily, if I'm going to screw up DC, I'm gonna go out spectacularly. But if I screw up DC, it's going to be because I'm beholden to continuity. Because the first thing I do when I get in there is I'm going to age down John Kent.
No,
I'm not going to apologize for it. It's going to happen in one panel. I'm not even going to waste a full issue doing it.
I thought we talked behind the scenes that the first thing you were going to do was put me on Batman.
Oh, yeah. Well, that too, Dark Knight.
I'm ready. I'm here.
With apologies for being tiny in the fourth. Yes.
I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm here for it. I think so. My question to you is what do you think is the logical progression? Like, do you think this is simply DC purging the company of people who are inhibiting the growth? Or do you think that this is a sign that maybe DC doesn't know what they're doing with all of these firings and whatnot? Is this like a very corporate kind of beyond the publishing level choice that at&t / Warner Brothers is making? And beyond that, what do you think is going to happen next? What does this mean? What is DC 5G going to be without Dan Didio?
Yeah, I actually do think that if we step back and take a look at what's happened in the last 2 years in particular, I think the letting go of Didio makes a lot of sense. We can't forget how much of a disastrous year DC had in 2018. Yeah. Remember that they fired a lot. They fired a significant portion of their staff. They cut back on their publishing. They focused on a young adult line for the very simple reason, because that's what bookstores are selling, the book scan charts. And they lost Vertigo, and they're revamping everything. They've went full Black Label, full horror. They've really they've mitigated their superhero publishing just at a time and the timing is very curious when you think about it, because the MCU is thriving. Marvel is puking out. If every Marvel writer everybody at Marvel seems to be getting their own series, and it's not even miniseries, they're full bore series. Marvel's exploding with titles. It's absolutely insane. DC's the exact opposite, and they're losing it on the sales charts. This thing, it's cumulative and it's taking its toll. And I do think that I did a video about 2-3 weeks ago on the kingdoms of the game of DC Thrones.
Yeah.
How it's like each kingdom, DC has too many kingdoms. Like if you walked into the DC offices, metaphorically speaking, you'd have, that's the first floor is Bendis, the second floor is Didio, the third floor is Snyder, the fourth floor is Morrison's Green Lantern, the fifth floor is DC Generate. I mean, it's like they have these little, everyone has their own little fiats, their own little kingdoms. And I know it's a little bit of a racist expression, but just bear with me. It's like too many chiefs, not enough Indians, right? I mean, come on. I mean, or too many chefs in the kitchen.
Yeah,
sometimes you got to decide on the menu. You got to pick a menu and stick with it, because because otherwise nothing tastes good if there's everything under the sun. Be a master of something, not a jack of all trades.
Quick sidestep. Someone in the chat, you actually have his thing posted here, Jalen Neely. Dude, you gotta chill with spamming the chat, man. Like you put the same message in there like 7 times. Gotta relax. We'll get to you when we get to you. Okay. Please chill. But yeah, no, sorry to derail the conversation. I just know that it's also bothering people in the chat here.
Yeah, I apologize. Just the people in the chat, when I'm the one that's controlling which comments appear on the screen, and when I'm talking, I have a hard time. I have a hard time drinking, talking, and flipping comments on the screen at the same time, but I'm doing my best.
No.
I'm confident enough to be DC editor-in-chief, so it's all good.
It's not your fault. It was like the one you highlighted. Like if you look at it, like there was like 4 of the same exact comment in that like grouping, and then he did it like 3 times before. So I was like, you got to chill. We'll get to you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing is, DC needs to reevaluate what they want to do. And I know, and unfortunately, I can't credit the person in the chat because I read it earlier, but someone had mentioned reestablishing DC's identity, which I think is very important. I think that there's some very significant things going on with DC that are positive. I think basically Black Label's fucking Vertigo. It's fucking Vertigo. Just a little bit less out there. I really like what they're doing, giving Joe Hill that outlet to tell horror comics. We're establishing DC Black Label as a way for people to tell genre fiction in comics, which I think is really cool. It gives a great outlet. I think having stories like that Last God, which is like a high fantasy series in comics, I think that's excellent. I think there are some very good things along that line. But not even the one thing. one massive thing that I know I have expressed a lot of negative feelings towards has been the direction of DC's main line the last 2 years. And I think that DC needs to use 5G to reestablish kind of the same feeling that we got from Rebirth, because I feel like Rebirth was a wonderful time for both old fans and new fans. I mean, when Rebirth came out, I was very much in the middle of being old fan and new fan, right? Like we talked about on our last stream, I've only been reading comics for 5-6 years. And I just kind of swallowed a bunch of back matter material, which kind of forcibly made me like an old fan, I guess, by now. But I think that we need somebody who, first and foremost, is effective at getting ideas across the board through the executives, but also has a passion for it. And so I think it's just the big question is what happens next? Who's taking that spot?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to Noel Martinez in the chat, was that Didio's exit effective immediately or by a certain date?
He's gone today.
It's I believe he is gone today. I know that there was a comment that apparently even as early as this morning, Friday morning, he was Dan Didio was in a private retailer Facebook chat where he had made some comments about even appearing at a Comic-Con this weekend on certain panels. So that would suggest to me, again, we don't have confirmation of this, but that would suggest to me that Dan Didio was in fact fired, that he was let go. That doesn't sound like sound like something that a person that was preparing to leave would do. But I mean, that's speculation. And so I guess we'll know more in the days that follow.
No doubt in my mind he was let go. I mean, say what you want about Dan Didio, whatever your perception of the guy is, and whether or not you feel like he had good ideas or bad ideas. The guy was very passionate. I mean, I've seen Dan Didio live quite a few times and heard him speak, and it's very clear that he has a passion for comics. And whether or not his idea of where DC should be going is right or wrong, good or bad, whatever, there's no way he chose to leave. And if he did choose to leave, they gave him an ultimatum where neither side was beneficial. So
it's funny because I remember one of the comments that Dan Didio made, and this was a couple years ago, and it was after Infinity War came out. I think in many levels, Dan Didio does understand what comic books need to be. It's just that the execution and how he's going about doing it, I think he's either being hindered because he's got too many people interfering with him, or something else is going on. And what he said was this: he made a comment about Infinity War, and he said about Marvel's Infinity War, he said that Marvel, the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, did comic books better than the publishing companies did comic books. And what he meant by that is the 22 to 23, whatever, Marvel movies were like comic books. Each individual one was an individual story that you could, and if you imagine 23 comic books, each individual comic being its own self-contained story, forming one larger narrative. It's extremely hard to find that sort of magic in comic books nowadays. I mean, in theory, you want to capture that, whether it's in Bendis's, year-long Rogol-Zar epic, or Scott Snyder's 39-issue Justice League epic, or Tom King's 85-issue Batman run. There's none of those, all of those pale in comparison to what 24 movies did for MCU. Now you might think, it's an unfair comparison.
It is.
But what I mean by that is it should be easy. It should be very easy, because when you write a comic book, I remember Greg Rucka, when he started writing Superman back in 2007 or 8, Greg Rucka went on, he gave an interview. He said that the best advice he got on writing Superman is that a friend of his reminded him that, remember that you don't have a budget. Your budget's unlimited. When you write a Superman story, you can have Superman do anything. You can have him destroy a planet or save a planet. There's no budget. You don't need to worry about special effects. So think big. And what I find sometimes is unfortunate is that these the writers, you can tell good and compelling stories and still have an ending and a compelling 3-part story in a number of issues. You don't have to bleed it out and decompress it over such a long period of time, because you end up destroying the integrity of your story. So I think that's what Didio meant when he made that comment, that there's no, people should be looking to comic books. We should have an Infinity event and an experience on the comic book level, the comic book equivalent of Infinity War, every year at least 5 or 6 times. There's no reason why we shouldn't. And it's unfortunate that we can't seem to duplicate what they're able to duplicate in the movies in a comic book form.
Well, there's 3 things I kind of want to say. One, I don't think I would ever really want DC or Marvel to do 5 or 6 crazy event level things, because I think that it devalues how special it is. There's a reason that in the 24 films we got, that only 4 of them were Avengers movies. Those were the big ones to shape the universe. So I definitely wouldn't want that, because A, it would devalue it. B, I think it would. It's essentially what Marvel's kind of been doing, where people are just getting tired of events. B, I really don't like the comparison for films to single comics. I think if you want to compare a graphic novel to a film, that's more apt, because first of all, you have to take into consideration the constraints of each medium. Comic books, right, especially now, and we had a conversation briefly about this on Twitter the other day, about how comics have been constrained average now down to about 20 pages a book, which is fucking horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible, because not only do you have to wait a month between every installment, you have to try to find a way to have each issue has some level of satisfaction or a cliffhanger, whatever you need, which really constrains these creators and the stories that they're trying to tell. B, you can read a comic book in 15 minutes. There's no way I'm comparing that to a 2-hour movie. A movie really fleshes out about a story arc worth of stuff, which is at least a graphic novel, which I'd be more comfortable making that comparison. But again, I think really, yeah, that's kind of my big statement around that. I think that was kind of a short-sighted comment.
Yeah.
Not to say the MCU isn't doing a fantastic job.
Yeah.
But
I hear what you're saying.
I don't think it's fair to make that shift. I think really what DC needs to do is to figure out exactly what they want their hierarchy to be. Because I think what I'm about to say is going to sound a little bit paradoxical. I think it's very important to have a line-wide identity. And I think, for example, Rebirth, generally speaking, established that, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, I think it's also important to be publishing different books for different types of people who have different tastes, which I think you can do as long as you're establishing a proper hierarchy. Look at, I think if we were able to combine the strength of DC's mainline when Rebirth launched and the strength of what DC is currently doing with Black Label, and that ability to kind of play out into genre fiction,
yeah,
DC would be firing on all cylinders, because it enables us to have a consensus on our main line where we can publish different types of stories that to a degree, at least at certain points, can all interweave into one really large, strong narrative. And then we can also go to Black Label for our totally out there stories that might or might not involve beloved characters that we already know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think really, aside from trying to find somebody who's passionate about the industry and about stories, you need a triple threat. You need that passion, you need somebody who knows how to tell stories, and you need somebody who knows an executive room to get these ideas across, which is a very difficult combination to find, which is why I think DC, to be effective, needs 2 co-publishers that between the 2 of them can fit that bill. Because I don't think it's possible necessarily, especially with today's day and age with massive corporate interference, to have one person that can accomplish that and be effective at it. As much as I like Jeff Johns, he fits 2 of those bills, and he's proven to be creative and to be able to execute when it comes to developing stories. But is he effective in the executive sense? Who knows? It seems like he was stepped over a lot from Warner Brothers executives in the past. So It's
Well,
got to be a balance. It's
yeah,
got to be a total
and you
balance.
got to wonder why Didio left, because it's possible that he might have quit if they maybe were promoting somebody above him and he felt it was a demotion. Or I mean, again, I think we're going to find out a lot in the days to come. It still seems a little bit crazy to me that of all the times that Didio has survived not being fired, I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm actually less pissed off at Didio with the current state of DC Comics than I have been in the past, because I actually think that maybe DC Generation 1 through 5 is going to be good. We got, because Generation 4 is the Age of Rebirth. Generation 2 is the Age of the Metahuman. 3, Age of Crisis. 4, Age of Rebirth. Generation 5 is Age of Tomorrow. And this is all of these are going to be one-shots coming out by the end of September of this year. We have Black Label. It's been successful, relatively. We got the Joe Hill comics that are critically acclaimed. DC was actually on the upswing, I thought, potentially.
Mainline has its issues, which is right. Why I think people like me are largely dissatisfied, because as much as I like those out there books, and I'm buying almost every Joe Hill book, I'm buying most of the Black Label books, and I'm starting to cut down on my mainline books, but really the mainline is your face. Like, as much as I loved the idea of Black Label, which is ultimately kind of transformed into something entirely different than what we were told 2 years ago. It doesn't matter how good that is if the main line doesn't have a concise vision, right? Because ultimately that's the face of the company, right? I mean, we could get, for example, the best Batman book ever in Black Label right now. But if the main Batman book isn't good, what's the headline? Batman's doing shit or whatever. Probably something more eloquent than that. So, I mean, there needs to be a compromise, and maybe they need to divide power in an efficient way, but there needs to be communication amongst those branches. I mean, I'm just so curious and kind of, I don't have an opinion necessarily as to what this means with Dan Didio and what's going to be going on. Again, I think these next couple months are going to be telling, and it almost makes me wonder if now that Didio's gone, what does that mean for 5G? Because that seemed to be his brainchild. And ISO Storm Gamer 558, I don't think it's going to be canceled.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to be canceled. That I guarantee you. They've already got solicits going right back to September 2020, outlining each of those one shots coming out. I think they're committed now. If they back out of 5G now, if that's what's happened, I mean, holy moly! Because holy moly, if this is followed up by a scrapping of 5G, then we know there's something major going on. There's no indications of that yet, but you know what? You never know what Bleeding Cool might come out with over the weekend here.
Well, there's something to be said, first of all, about their history, right? Like, DC and big publishers in general aren't against pulling solicits. They've done it. I mean, look at how many times Doomsday Clock was solicited, and then they're like, yeah, let's wait another fucking half a year for an issue, or Jeff Johns Shazam or whatever. Like, the company's not afraid to do it. I think the big question is, what was 5G going to be under Didio, and what is it going to be now? I think that no matter what happens, whether or not 5G is going to be good, or whether or not 5G is going to be bad, is what would it have been under Dan Didio? Because I don't think there's any way they cancel it.
Javier Montano states that Ethan Van Sciver, of course, he's the well-known former artist on the Green Lantern, and he's now his own indie publisher of Cyberfrog. Apparently, Van Sciver said on his channel that 5G will be a test for AT&T, in his opinion, and if it doesn't do well, it may be the end. I know Ethan Van Sciver has been somewhat of a doomsayer about the future of the industry that has treated him so well, and I hope that he's wrong. He's got a very sort of he's growing increasingly cynical about the big two and about the manner in which they've approached comic books. He's not the only one. It's interesting. I don't know, when he says it's a test for AT&T, I'm not really sure how I'm not sure what at&t would be expecting, but perhaps, obviously, this goes into what your earlier comments were, Dark Knight, that perhaps some higher ups at at&t didn't like Dan Didio's sensibilities, and maybe this 5G was more maybe corporately demanded.
I don't know. I mean, at least the title, because it's, they're trying to work their way into the search algorithms, because again, AT&T is going to be like releasing line-wide 5G service within the next year. So I'm sure that's like, unfortunately, the big push behind it. But I also think that it's so, I mean, first of all, I don't want to get into the politics of like EVS in this conversation. Just because that in and of itself would turn itself into a downward spiral. I think certainly, him being a veteran of the industry, there's got to be something behind what he's saying, but to the same degree, I know he has a lot of bias. So
not everybody is a big fan in the chat of Mr. Van Sciver, notwithstanding his mark on the industry and his obvious talents as an artist.
Yeah, I don't really personally I don't really want to get into the Van Sciver conversation, because that opens up another can of worms.
Well, no, well, we can still have the conversation about its relationship to AT&T. I mean, there's been AT&T did purchase Warner, so I mean, there's no question that there's a changing of the corporate guards here.
Oh, yeah.
And clearly, I think it makes sense. We know what happened when Marvel, acquired, Lucasfilm and then bought Marvel. I mean, there was a changing of the guard at Marvel, and there's a shifting. Look how Marvel has changed as a comic book publisher. Now they're doubling down on all the comic books with the billion-dollar success of the MCU movies, even though those companies, the comic division and the movie division, are technically unrelated. I argue that, in fact, they are part of the same company. So
well, I mean, you got to look at who's leading it now. I mean, Kevin Feige is now not only in charge of the Marvel films and that kind of entertainment sector, like visual entertainment sector on the screen, he's also now head of publishing as well. Like, he's in charge of everything Marvel now. So there's something to be said about that. I think also, like, Kevin Feige in and of itself, like, not only is he effective at just doing his job, he is also a fan. He is also passionate. Yeah. I think the next, I think one good thing to discuss here moving forward, or at least to play around with, is I have a quick thought exercise. Comic Boom. Dan Didio is now fired, and DC hits your lineup and says, "You sweet Canadian man, we want you to take over as publisher of DC Comics. You have to do something called 5G.
Not a problem.
But what happens with it is up to you. What are you doing? What is your solution to ail all of the concerns about DC right now? What direction are you moving in?"
Well, look, I think, first of all, I would confirm the fact that I am sweet. I'm a very sweet guy. I think everybody knows that. Obviously. I mean, I exude sweetness. I have a natural charisma. People would love me.
Confirm. I spent a whole weekend with you in New York, and that was a hell of a time. So I can't confirm.
First, so there's that, and that's important. But no, look, I feel a little bit like the guy who was sort of asked to, clean up after a hurricane and then get blamed for what the hurricane did. I mean, look, 5G's already in the bag. I'm sure they've got, the artists are probably halfway done working on all the promotional material. There's a lot of things being kept under wraps. There's a lot of secrets being kept right now. Nobody wants to ruin the surprise of what's coming out. The reality here is that there's a lot of moving parts. I do think that there's a lot of potential here. The generation, I mean, to tie in, I would go with it. I like the idea of one timeline. Mm-hmm. I think Marvel has the right idea with one continuity. I love the fact that Marvel says, you know what? we have one continuity. We know it's messy, but we insist on it. It's one continuity. It doesn't always fit. We know you don't like One More Day, but it happened. Get over it. It fits. Sorry, Spider fans, just get used to it. It all happened. It's one linear timeline. Thank you very much. And we don't care what the X-Men did in the past or this or that or blah blah blah. It all makes sense. If you don't understand it, just pretend you do, and they move along. DC's problem has been, they can't get over it. They can't let shit go. They got to have a crisis every 5 years. They got to have a crisis. They got to use the word crisis, and they got to make a big deal. I would say no. The advantage of the Generation 1 through the Generation 5 timeline is that they are saying, DC is finally saying, you know what? It did all happen. It all happened, and this is the timeline that it happened in. And whether it's Generation 1, the Age of Mysteries, Generation 2, Age of the Metahuman, Generation 3, the Age of Crisis, Generation 4, the Age of Rebirth, or Generation 5, the Age of Tomorrow, everything's happened. And that way, and this is what I thought Dan Didio would like. I thought maybe this was his idea for the simple reason that now when a writer comes along and has a story idea for DC Comics, there's a fairly good possibility that no matter how crazy the story is, you'll be able to pick a generation to tell that story in. Is this a Generation 1 or a 2 or a 4 or a 5 story? How can we fit your story in to a particular timeline, or ask the writer, where do you see your story? There's so much potential here, not to mention hyper time, Elseworld sagas, which could potentially come into play as well. So quite frankly, I don't see anything. This is what I mean earlier when I said I didn't think Didio, of all the times that I wanted the guy to leave, I actually thought maybe they're onto something with this generation thing. I'm willing to give it a chance because I'm so frustrated with the darkness. This here, it looks like there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So I don't know if I'd do a lot different. I would just, I would have a long talk with Bendis. And if he annoyed me, it would be a very short talk. And I would want my authority to breach the contract. Because it might be cheaper to pay him out than to have him keep working for DC. That's just my 2 cents worth.
Well, so I guess if I were in that position, me answering an unsolicited question, I think I would do 5G because I think the opportunity to move a little bit outside of, the characters that we know and love, in terms of like the current generation, the Bruce Wayne, the Clark Kent, the Diana Prince, the Hal Jordan, the Barry Allen generation.
Yep.
I think that telling the story of another generation would be beneficial to DC in 2 ways. One, they would be able to develop more of a fan base, which already exists for a lot of these characters, and establish them as their own set of heroes. And 2, I think it would also make people miss the original Legacy characters. I think it would endear us more to them, because if we take a couple years away from them and then we bring them back and put them back in the spotlight, because it's inevitable, right? Let's not act like it's not. No matter what happens, we're always going to get Bruce Wayne back. We're going to get Clark Kent back. We're going to get Diana back. I think that it will make people reevaluate why those characters mean a lot to them. But for me, I would do one of 2 things. My 5th generation would be making the next generation of DC characters, as in the Dick Graysons, the Donna Troys, the Gars, the Garth, whatever his last name is. I don't know what Aqualad's or Tempest's last name is, but making that generation step up.
Yeah,
because a majority of them haven't gotten the opportunity to do it for a long period of time.
Well, I think that's going to happen, Dark Knight. I think that's what Age of Tomorrow is between the Generation 4 and 5.
I mean, based on what and the rumors, it's just a rumor mill. I mean, we hear about all these other random. They're creating new Legacy characters, which I don't think works, because we haven't given the other characters an opportunity to take these mantles, who again have fan bases and can be and whose fan bases can be built upon. But say somebody above me says, no, we have to go far-flung into the future. This is how we validate the Legion. We get Bendis off Legion. One of 2 things will happen. I will either pay Jeff Johns or Jonathan Hickman more money than I've ever seen in my life to come in and head that operation.
Yeah.
And 5G is where we tell the new Legion stories.
Yeah.
Because Legion is such a mixed bag, right? It has such a wealth of die-hard fans, but also a lot of people that have no fucking idea what they are.
Yeah.
Which can be a good thing. It can be a very good thing because you get someone in there who can world build, who knows and loves the continuity, and can execute story to craft something with them. You can push that forward. So if we're not doing that kind of the next generation, the next direct generation under what we have now, I think that's how you validate the Legion, because there's no question at how much of a failure Bendis's Legion of Superheroes is. And I think it is an important property of DC. It is indicative of the legacy of DC. And I think that 5G should have been under better hands than what they have now, right? Under the control of better than Bendis.
Well, you're right. You make a good point insofar as maybe AT&T or the higher ups, maybe they don't like what they see with 5G. Maybe they don't have a lot of confidence in it. And we don't really know who the brainchild of 5G was. Whose idea was that? I mean, it really does seem a little bit out of left field. It's demonstrably different than anything that's been done before, quite frankly. But they are trying to create one long, cohesive story. They want to say that all the stories matter. Now, how is that going to fit in? How is that going to work? I'm not sure. Now, it is interesting. Paul Acosta made a point that, and this is tying into your point, Dark Knight. He said, now he mentions Walter Hamada, which is a name that I'm not particularly familiar with. He says it's the president of DC Films. He's the executive producer of Aquaman, Shazam, and Joker. It's a good point. Is it possible that maybe this person has a say in what's going on in comic book publishing? Is AT&T maybe they want to have more of a film influence on the comics, and maybe that's why they want the 5G? Or it's interesting to speculate, because when you mention the criticism of Legion that you pointed out, Dark Knight, it is something that's a little bit it does seem rather it came about in rather somewhat of a confusing and disjointed way, in a very underwhelming way. But I'm not sure how would you speculate on that?
Well, I'm sure that no, I don't think Walter Hamada has anything to do with publishing, because regardless, he's going to make whatever movies he wants to make. No doubt in my mind. I mean, obviously Joker has absolutely nothing to do with comics. None whatsoever. They made a high art film with a familiar name. And let's be real, that Joker is nothing like the Joker in the comics. And it was mind you, like top 3 movie of the year for me. I love Joker. But I don't think Walter Hamada has anything to say with the comics, because no matter what happens in the comics, he's going to make the films he wants to make. I think that it really all depends on what DC wants, what image DC is trying to set for itself. I see in the comments, Tim Board from Hawkman says, if the classic characters go away, I would go away too. Until they come back, the characters are loved. I get that those characters are loved, but there's only so many things you can do with those characters. And I think as endearing and as eternal as eternal as they are, I think it really limits us when we have other generations of heroes that are loved and that have the potential to be developed, to not give them that time. And for me, I love this generation. I mean, obviously, pretty much everybody does. I mean, Bruce Wayne will always be my Batman. Carter Hall will always be my Hawkman. Superman, Clark Kent, so on and so forth. But I think that we should be giving these other generations of legacy characters an opportunity to either take those mantles and continue on in the footsteps, or completely reinterpret those mantles, because no matter what, we will always have our first generation of heroes to love and to behold and to endear those stories. And again, just knowing the cyclical nature of comics, I mean, it's your prerogative to stop reading DC if that's the case. But for me, I would invite it, because I think it would bring a fresh energy. I think if handled right, these characters are so, for example, if you're doing the direct next generation of DC Comics characters, I think that they are so different from their predecessors that it would bring an entirely different energy, and I think it would be kind of exciting.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you a question, Dark Knight, because if Dan Didio has been, and just to reiterate those just joining us, or because we have 24 people in the chat, which is quite a lot for us anyway. Dan Didio, of course, co-publisher DC Comics, announced, or I guess he's leaving DC, and he's been there for 18 years, and that's breaking news. And what I find phenomenal about Dan Didio is that he has over the span of 18 years taken very different editorial approaches to DC Comics. Let me defend Dan Didio a bit and why Dan Didio might be really frustrated, because Dan Didio, he brought in Wednesday's comics. He tried the newsprint. He champions New Comic Book Day. He championed Free Comic Book Day. He tried Rebirth. He did the New 52. He put story over continuity. He tried that. He said, well, maybe continuity is not good. Let's go story over continuity. Well, that wasn't good. Okay, well, then they embraced New 52. That was phenomenal success. But then he was sort of overridden. Johns came along. Then they did Rebirth. And then along came Metal. And that was dark. And Scott Snyder. And so, in a way, Dan Didio did, in a very real way, he gave us multiple different editorial approaches to comic books. We got the Rebirth, we got the dark, we got New 52, we got Metal, we got Darkness. Now we have horror. We got Joe's Comics, we got Black Label. We've gotten a lot of different editorial approaches under Dan Didio. So my question is, and I give to people in the chat, is what are we bitching about? If we want Dan Didio fired, what should he have? Should he have just picked one? Should he have picked one and just stuck with it? Or is his problem that he changes like the wind? Like he's got to pick one, because in a way it's like Dan Didio. Sometimes I got the impression the guy's he's like he's in a round room trying to find a corner to piss in. Like he's got to make up his mind. So was Dan Didio's problem a lack of consistency? Should he have picked one? Should they have stuck with the New 52? I mean, to me, there's that old. Remember that there's that expression. Do you give fans what they want, or do you give them what they need? And that's maybe at the heart of being a good editor. But Dan Didio, he tried to wear too many different hats, and he kept changing his hat every now and then. And look, it made him bold.
I think that the biggest issue is we're not totally in the know as to what exactly Dan Didio championed. Again, there's conjecture amongst fans. But like I said at the beginning of this stream, I'm not comfortable putting a lot of blame on Didio because we're only aware of so much that went on. You know, there's a lot that happens kind of behind the corner or behind closed doors. So, personally, again, I know a lot of people are excited about Dan Didio leaving. I think whatever happens next is going to define how I'm going to feel about it, obviously, because I'm not completely aware of what went on behind closed doors. So I don't know. I'm very uncomfortable kind of taking a stance as to whether or not I'm happy or not. I mean, unfortunately, and if you put it down to its most basic thing, like a guy just lost his job. So all in all, I wish the guy the best.
Well, Dark Knight, you'll appreciate this. There's an old expression. Have you ever heard of you've heard of Okar's razor?
No.
It's a basic concept saying that no matter how complex a problem, Okar's razor says that the most simple answer is usually the answer. All right. So in other words, don't complicate things. Keep it simple. What's the likely reason that he lost his job? Well, the simple answer is sales aren't that great. How are sales? They're actually terrible. Thank you very much. Look at the recent decisions being made of Bendis. Bendis is coming. Everybody wants Bendis to go. These are major disasters. Now, obviously, going on behind the scenes, the higher-ups must not be happy with what they see. They must not be happy. And they're afraid, they're shareholders. And you know what? They're not going to, they probably don't share. Didio's probably established a lot of personal relationships that maybe he's reluctant to be the hard ass editor he needs to be to get the job done.
I mean, primarily, again, the issue is we don't know how much, Warner Brothers and or at&t has interfered from above, right? Because they're trying to sell various numbers of products, and that, of course, can hinder the story potential that is given.
Thank you, Professor, for the correction.
That can hinder the story potential from various editors and creators. So I think it's rough. I just hope that whatever I'm really unsure of making and forming a hard statement on whether or not I'm happy or not based on what Didio has done in the past. Yeah. But I just hope that whatever happens in the future, they put somebody in that position who is passionate about these characters, about the legacy, can execute on a story level, and can execute within, the boardroom, the business room, right, to get ideas across. Because, from a business perspective, I understand these bigger companies' desires to sell merchandise, right? Like metal was huge when it comes to merchandise. I mean, people not only bought comics, look at how many Batman Who Laughs statues, toys, this, that, and the other thing are out there. Look at, and how financially successful that was of a movie, of a movement.
Yeah, Jace Millam does make a good point. We are sort of we're mixing up the EIC versus the public. Didio is, of course, he's the co-publisher. I'm not actually. Does DC actually even theoretically? Who is the editor in chief now of DC Comics?
Well, that's the thing, is that I feel like
do they even have one.
They do.
Maybe that's the problem. They don't need one. They need to hire me immediately.
I think the big issue is that between Marvel and DC, just by virtue of who's kind of on top of those companies, I don't necessarily think that positions in the editorial or executive ladder have the same exact function between companies, right? Because look at DC. When we think big initiatives of story, who did we think of? We thought of Dan Didio as publisher. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to Marvel, who seems to be that same face? C.B. Cebulski, who is the editor-in-chief. So I can't help but think that both companies individually are taking different approaches as to what each position is responsible for, right? Like, Am I wrong in thinking that, like, when it comes to initiatives, at least for this past year or however long, it's been like Dan Didio at DC and C.B. Cebulski at Marvel?
Well, Didio's done all the PR work. But obviously behind the scenes, that might be something different going on behind the scenes. I got to say, by the way, just a quick note, Bob Harris they confirmed as the editor-in-chief of DC. Bob Harris had a terrible reputation at Marvel, and lots of people at Marvel did not like him. He's responsible for one of the worst periods in Marvel, arguably Marvel history. A lot of people did not like Bob Harris at Marvel, and they were not happy when it went over to DC. So, you know what? That might be part of the problem right there, Bob Harris. Yeah. I mean, that's the guy that's, I think Didio might be taking the bullet for somebody that deserves to be fired even more than he does.
I mean, to be honest, I don't, how long has Bob Harris been EIC at DC? I think is a big question. But somebody brought something up earlier that I thought was an interesting topic of conversation, and I don't exactly remember what it was. Oh, well, I guess that's...
Yeah. In the meantime, while you're thinking on that, while you're finding that, Dark Knight, Professor Bill, Comic Book University. Hey, Professor, he just wants to know what's going to happen to Metal Man. It's a good point. Metal Man's at issue 5. I think issue 5 just came out this week. I actually like Metal Man. Dan Didio is actually not a bad writer. I got to tell you, there are worse writers than Dan Didio. I enjoy it. Metal Man even has some allusions to DC Generation 5 or 4, one of them. It's depending on, there's still some mystery there, but we don't know what's going to happen. So it's going to be interesting to see what fate has in store for the Metal Men. Dan Didio had actually a pretty good sort of reimagining of the Metal Men.
Dude, I honestly, like, Dan Didio as a writer. I mean, I'm not championing him to the same degree that I would like a Brubaker or whatever, but, like, I mean, if you look at even what was that, the New Age of Heroes, Sideways was arguably the best book out of that line. and the most creative and innovative. And then Metalman has been, I mean, I'm behind in the book, but Metalman has been such a good time. And mind you, like Metalman was never kind of a corner of the DC universe that I found myself superbly interested in. And
Yeah.
it's been such a fun book. I think that depending on how messy this breakup was, Didio could still be writing it. He could kind of take up a temporary freelance, thing to finish the book. I don't know.
I think he'll finish his run. And when you mentioned a lot of people in the chat, they've also mentioned Sideways. The Tempest Fugonaut is a major character that Dan Didio introduced in Sideways, and Tempest Fugonaut plays a major role in Flash Forward. And of course, Flash Forward number 6 came out, ending with Wally West coming back in full glory, now sitting on the Mobius chair, which was infused with the power of Dr. Manhattan, which will presumably play a large role in Flash 750, and then moving into DC Generation Zero, which is the Free Comic Book Day, and then leading into the new generation timelines. So, he's left his mark. So not only, I mean, to give some credit to Didio, he's not only has his skill set as a publisher, yay or nay, but he does have some forward-looking vision in his writing. So give credit where credit's due.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm honestly interested in to see what happens with him next, like whether or not he takes up a position at another publisher, if he sticks to writing freelance, or if maybe he just retires completely. I mean, I think the guy's 60, which, considering he's held a pretty high executive position at DC Publishing for the better part of 2 decades, whether or not he was vice president of editorial or whatever.
Yeah,
I mean, the guy's got to have a good enough of a nest egg to potentially even retire at this point. So I think that's a big question as to what's going to happen with him, and then obviously what his replacement's going to be like.
Well,
and I agree. I mean, we said this earlier. I agree with Professor Bill. No doubt in my mind he was fired. No doubt, because say what you want about him, but again, he was passionate about the publisher, whether or not you agree with his decisions or not. A. B, obviously we talked about how sudden this was. I mean, as early as this morning, I guess he was having, conversations with retailers and whatnot, not to mention scheduling public appearances at future conventions. So, there's no doubt in my mind he was fired.
Yeah. And you know what? At the same time, he probably has a nice little nest egg. And there has to be a part of him, I think, that, maybe he doesn't need the headache anymore. I mean, really, he can just relax and write Metalman, or relax. And I'm sure, he's a good enough writer. I mean, I wouldn't, when I get the call tomorrow and I become the new editor in chief, I'm going to let him complete Metalman straight up, Well, I'm going to give him a different office. I'm not going to lie. He's not going to get the big office. I'm going to move him out because, I'm going to renovate the office. It's going to look much better. I got a lot. My office will look better.
That's also if he wants to. I mean, we don't know as of right now how sloppy this breakup was, which there could be bad blood. Maybe he doesn't want anything to do with DC, which obviously I'm sure we'll be learning more and more about as time goes on. So I'm interested to see as to whether or not, this was a gracious leave, or if not.
There we go. Professor is going to finish Metalman for us. Professor, Dark Knight and I are the new co-editors, editor-in-chiefs of DC Comics. So we'll give you a call and we'll talk Metalman, and we'll explore any ideas you have.
Oh boy, this is going to be an interesting couple of months for DC, seeing where things go. That's for sure.
Yeah. Would I accept a cubicle after a corner office? Well, probably not. No.
Well, I mean, writers don't necessarily even have. I mean, a lot of writers at DC. I mean, pretty much all of them work from home. Most people who work full time in the office are going to be, editorial staff and things of that nature. So, most writers don't even live in LA, for that matter, or Burbank, I guess. I mean, I think first and foremost, obviously, knowing that Dan Didio has ruptured relationships with a lot of big creators, I think DC should be focusing on trying to get some of those names back. I mean, regardless of even Mark Waid, Ed Brubaker, that's huge. Getting Ed Brubaker to come back to DC. I know, like, because from what I understand, he won't work for DC because of Didio. And with Didio being gone, does that open that up, to bring somebody like Brubaker back?
Well, if we're going to bring Brubaker back, then the question becomes, what are we going to eliminate anything? Tim Board asks, lots of cancellations up ahead? ? My response to that, Tim, would be to say, cancel what? They're not publishing very much to begin with. I mean, good grief. I mean, DC's already slashed so much. DC's already leading into 5G. You'll note that we have a lot of miniseries. We have a lot of miniseries, like 6-issue series or 12-issue series. And the reason for that is that we're prepping for 5G. That's what DC has been doing. There's a reason why we're getting everything is wrapping up. All the storylines are wrapping up in Aquaman, Teen Titans. They're all wrapping up, and it's leading into that DC Generation Zero on Free Comic Book Day. And we're going to be getting something decidedly different, or maybe not, ? From April moving onward. And in terms of cancellations, in a sense, we are getting a cancellation of the status quo as it exists right now. That we're getting a kickstart with DC with the 5G. No question in my mind. To me, that's a de facto cancellation. It's a judgment on what's come before. And to me, 5G is a rather significant shift forward and a little bit of flipping the bird to the past, even though they say they're not doing that, but the jury's still out.
Well, I think it all depends on as to whether or not the rumor mill, proves to be true, with what Bleeding Cool comes out with and on all that odd speculation and conjecture. I mean, who knows? Whether or not, DC getting fired or not means as much to this. DC 5G could have been something totally different than what we've heard from Bleeding Cool and these other sources. As far as we know, whatever was leaked to them could have just been a thought that, and Bleeding Cool being what it was isn't exactly like the greatest vestige of journalism. So who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, all I want moving forward is a line of DC comics that I can respect. Rebirth for me as a comic book fan was honestly, again, I haven't been actively reading, the concurrent periodical titles for more than 6 or so years. But DC Rebirth was such an amazing time for me to be a fan of DC Comics.
Yeah.
So I think that reinstilling that type of identity in the main line and continuing to pursue this kind of eclectic bunch of titles through Black Label, and then having your youth line over here doing what it's doing, bringing books into that kind of like scholastic school fair type of realm. I think that's smart. I think that they need to figure out what type of identity they want each one of these lines to stand for. And obviously the main line needs to be their priority, because that's where Black Label and that's where these kids lines stem from. And the thing that I think DC has gotten far away from is realizing that these stories that are making big money at in film or in television, they come from comics. So ultimately, if the well of comic book stories dry up, those adaptations will have no more room to go. So I think that in bettering their main line and reestablishing an identity that coincides with the legacy of the company, that is also progressive enough to be moved forward, I think that would put pretty much every potential aspect of DC entertainment, not just comics, in a much better place.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. One of the building on what you said, my worry is that with the 5G timeline is that if you're telling a story, if I'm reading a story that I know is in the 3rd generation or the 4th, since I already know the outcome because I know the 5th generation, will that take away from my enjoyment of reading a 3rd or 4th generation story? Now, it shouldn't if it's character-based stories. I mean, I'm not naive, I get it, but part of my love of DC Comics is I do love great plots. I love plots that are moved forward by the character decisions. But if I already know that Batman is alive and well in fifth generation, or his daughter is fine and is a fifth generation character, or Aquaman and Mira's daughter is alive and well in fifth generation, the stakes aren't quite as high if I'm reading a fourth generation story or something that takes place before 4 or 5G. So I mean, part of it, I'm a little concerned about knowing the outcome in advance, because it destroys the illusion of that unpredictability.
Well, that's why if they're gonna tell stories that are remotely in the future, it needs to be so far flung, that it's almost disconnected, to the point where we can, whatever is going to happen in the immediate present, as in like this generation of Bruce, Clark, Diana, is so far removed that we can go and do these other things out in the future. It's such a rough position for DC, because I think that at this point, no matter what decision they make, they're going to get flack, right? Like, yeah, they're going to get flack from somebody. So whether or not we're pursuing stories with the current generation, or we move things forward with whatever other generation, but it's tough to say what's going to be happening next.
Yeah. Dark Knight, I'll give you this question. They've got Professor says they've got Jeff Johns. Would he rather do TV and movies instead of DC Comics publisher? What do you think?
I think he would. Unfortunately, I'd like him to be a publisher, because he knows the industry and he knows these characters. But I think that he has kind of this undying motivation to do something in television and film. And I brought it up earlier. I mean, he was Dick Donner's assistant. So, and I believe he went to school for something more related to film. So I think that that's kind of an avenue that he's hoping to move into that direction. But
yeah, Jace Mellum says Johns left as chief creative officer, and it was the same speculation. Was he fired or did he leave? I know there was speculation at the time. Was he maybe pushed out or got frustrated with it? Obviously, I know Johns does have some talent as a producer for TV. I think he's not as good. Unfortunately he's not a Kevin Feige. I think he showed that with his Green Lantern and his subs. But although Wonder Woman wasn't bad, he was a producer on Wonder Woman, as I understand it. But again, he's no Kevin Feige. But maybe, he might have more potential and can make more at&t more money as a producer for TV than he can selling $50,000 Shazam, 50,000 monthly Shazam comic books. So from an economic point of view, if I'm at&t, I probably want Jeff Johns working on Stargirl than the TV show than on Stargirl the comic that will sell 15 to 20,000 issues a month.
Well, I mean, first thing to take note of is that like a producer's role in film and television isn't hard and fast. I mean, some producers have a lot of input as to what's going on set. Some producers just provide money. So there's the role of a producer is so ambiguous. Second off, not only was he a producer on Wonder Woman, he was a co-writer. He's credited with co-writing the screenplay with Patty Jenkins, which is important because that's a distinctly different role from just being a producer or an executive producer. I think, I mean, selfishly, I want Jeff Johns to be the publisher again. I mean, and to take, or EIC or whatever, to take some sort of editorial control, because obviously the beginning of Rebirth was one of the strongest eras of DC in a long time. And look at what was happening. He was having almost daily meetings with DC creators to establish, what direction they wanted the universe to go in. So I think that's super important. But I don't see, unfortunately, I don't think he would take the job as publisher. I think he's definitely feeling more that television and film route. And to be honest, with all of the intervention we've seen, in the film studio, I wouldn't even be surprised if Jeff Johns was trying to distance himself from DC and Warner Brothers, which is unfortunate. Because I love Jeff Johns, and I think that he knows the DC universe better than anybody else.
Yeah, it's interesting about Jeff Johns, because in many ways, I remember when before Justice League came out, the promotion for Justice League, Jeff Johns was alongside Kevin Smith on a TV special. They talked about Justice League. He promoted it. Jeff Johns actually was the face of DC Comics, and he was actually beginning to interact more physically with social media. He was the face of DC Comics. I mean, gone are the days of Jeff Johns holding up those Green Lantern rings, and going like this. And, he was really getting into it. Then all of a sudden he's by the wayside and he's focusing more on TV and movies. And, it's really weird. I realize Jeff Johns in interviews, he's kind of a subdued guy. He's not particularly animated or a super exciting kind of speaker. You know what I mean? But he does speak with sincerity and an undercurrent of understated passion. But he doesn't quite. It's like I've never felt that he's really felt comfortable in the role. He's not like Kevin Feige. Kevin Feige, he throws on the cap, the coat, and he walks out and he'll sit in front of a crowd and he get a crowd going. Johns, doesn't seem to have quite that disposition or the inclination to do that. And it's unfortunate. He's very talented, and he's got a knack for I think advising writers on trying to get a handle on characters. But I don't know. It's with Johns on Wonder Woman, his advising Patty Jenkins on Wonder Woman, his advising on the presumably there's the next Aquaman movie. I'm assuming is Johns advising? Maybe some people in the chat, is he advising on the next comic book on the next comic book movie, Suicide Squad 2? I'm not sure. Is Johns advising on that?
I have no idea. And again, advising is like arbitrary because people get executive producer credits without really doing anything, right? So, I don't know. I doubt it because he's not. I mean, the only thing that I know he is currently involved in when it comes to film is writing a script for the next Green Lantern movie, which who knows what's happening with that, considering last thing we heard was that the HBO Max was kind of like moving towards a direction of putting out a Green Lantern Corps style television show. So that does beg the question as to whether or not they're going to have both a film and a television show, because from last I heard, the film was going to be a Corps style film. And I don't know why you would kind of play in that same space under both the television and film domain. So I'm curious to see what's going on with that. But I mean, yeah, I think you're 100% right. I don't think Jeff Johns was ever comfortable in an executive role because ultimately Jeff Johns is an artist. Jeff Johns is a crafter of story, a builder of worlds, and a lover of continuity. And I don't think that being an executive is his strong suit. Because I think he is more concentrated on creating stories that appeal to people than he is on selling things. Because ultimately, if you tell great stories, or not ultimately, theoretically, the money will come. It's not always the case. There are award-winning writers that don't sell. There are award-winning projects that don't sell. But I think that Jeff Johns has an acumen for creating things, and giving him a high role in editorial, I think, would be huge. And I think that kind of the hierarchy of DC and Warner Brothers executives stepping off and letting Jeff Johns do him in an editorial position with a lot of power would be beneficial to the line for sure.
Yeah. We've talked for like an hour and a half. We just wanted to, I'm absolutely, this is obviously big news. I wasn't thinking we would get 24 people in the chat. I think that we've covered a lot of, we've talked, I mean, the topic here that we just wanted, Dark Knight and I just wanted to BS a little bit. For those who are just joining us in the chat, it was late this afternoon. I was bored at work and I had a bathroom break and I came back, and then I see the correspondence from Dark Knight telling me that Didio was let go or no longer working. And I couldn't believe it, how quick it happened. This is stunning. I think this is a major event. I think this is the equivalent of an earthquake. And I think this is a sign. Clearly, as we've mentioned a few times already, I mentioned it once, so did Dark Knight. Dan Didio was on a retail Facebook chat early this morning, by all accounts. Never mentioned anything. He talked about speaking on a panel on the weekend. And then all of a sudden this afternoon, Dan Didio is no longer at DC Comics. He was fired. That seems to me he was fired. Mm-hmm. How this plays out, how exactly the who's, the whys, the wherefores, the finger pointing. I think we're going to be hearing a lot. I think Bleeding Cool is going to be going insane over the weekend with rumors and innuendo. I think the accolades for Dan Didio, they've started on Twitter. Of course, they started immediately. He's got a lot of people who love him. Dan Didio is a beloved person by many people in the industry. He gave a lot of artists and writers their beginnings, their starts. And he's also responsible for some major blunders with DC, but also some of DC's most major successes. Everything from Wednesday's Comics to even the weekly 52, which Didio was part of. But he was also part of the DC Countdown, which was a disaster. He was part of the successful New 52, which was initially phenomenally successful, as you mentioned, Dark Knight. Then, of course, we got Rebirth, but then that's replaced with Metal. Then we have Darkness. Now we have 5G. Now we have a downturn in sales. Then we had 2018 with a catastrophic downturn in graphic novels and trade sales by DC. And here we are 2 years later. Last year, we had a huge cutting of the workforce by Warner Brothers.
Well, even
last year.
Even now, this massive overturn of editorial. I mean, again,
Yeah.
I saw a list, and there's between, including Didio, we've lost at least 10 pretty decent figures of DC's editorial and publishing line lost to the wind for whatever reason. So I have a feeling that whatever is happening, whatever happens next, is going to be huge.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a massive shift because obviously DC, Dan Didio is an integral part of DC. But again, that massive shift in all of these, and there's no way it's coincidence. There's no way that we've seen obviously terminations of folks. There's no way it's a coincidence that people are finding positions through other publishers as of late. I mean, something's going on. And whether or not it's good or bad, we'll see. I'd like to keep an open mind because for me, change means something that is inherently going to be different than what we have now. And I don't personally love what's going down on DC's mainline right now.
But
I also like and we talked about this a little bit on our last stream. I feel like DC's main line for the most part right now feels like an intermediary for whatever's coming next. And that is a little bit disappointing because it feels like whatever is going to happen right now in DC's main line is going to be ineffective at leaving a mark on any of these characters. Yeah. I mean, we've talked before about how you had a source, regarding, Steve Orlando and how there were some things that they weren't letting him touch in regards to 5G. And it just makes me feel like, this is a real middle point period before 5G. And it almost also makes me feel like, or question why I'm reading DC Comics, because I know nothing big is going to happen until 5G.
Yeah, well, that's true. And, but I guess that's always true. That's the nature of solicitations, and we can still, at least we know, I mean, I guess to be a smartass about it, at least we know these current storylines are actually going to end. So there's that. But, fundamentally, there's also one other comment that I think needs to be made here. We've had an editorial environment. Yes, he's been a publisher for the last 5 years or whatever it is, but Dan Didio's mark, I mean, that just doesn't go away overnight. So whoever replaces Dan Didio, I mean, this is a personality that is beloved in the industry. He's got a lot of influence. He'll still have a lot of influence even when he's not at DC or whatever he chooses to do. I mean, who knows where he's going to go? Who's going to replace him? And, you can get somebody that might have better instincts than Dan Didio. But what about the contacts? What about the people skills? And I know we've been hard on Dan Didio, but there's always the it factor, right?
I'd like to think I've been pretty neutral on Dan Didio. To be fair, I feel like I've been pretty neutral. Yeah, I mean, I said it earlier that whoever picks up the publisher position simultaneously has to have multiple different skill sets, both in story and as essentially an executive role, right? Somebody who's able to talk to the suits essentially and get these things moving, which I think is going to be difficult because most people, for example, we're talking about Jeff Johns. He's a creator. He's an artist. And
Yeah.
with that being said, he wasn't the best dealing with business people. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. I mean, he's arguably, I mean, I don't even think it's an argument. I mean, he's one of the top 5 best comic book writers we've seen in the last couple of decades, maybe even of all time.
Yeah.
So, it's tough to say. I just hope that whatever happens to DC moving forward is fueled by a love for the universe and a love for the characters. Ultimately, I know it's fueled by money, but I would like to think that somehow that could go hand in hand with paying respect to the universe and also trying to push it into the future, right? Because as much as there are a lot of things that we want to preserve about the universe and these characters and these stories, we also don't want it to go dry and be stagnant, right? Like we want to see some new things. We want to be able to expand what not only this publisher can be, but what the medium can be.
Yeah.
So, it's all in the hands of whoever comes next.
Yeah. And Jace Millen makes an interesting comment that might be true. He says that they'll probably just stick with Jim Lee as publisher and they won't even replace Dan. That's a possibility. They have fewer titles now. They got fewer titles. Maybe they don't. Why do they need 2 publishers? That's a legitimate point. And let's face it, if you got to choose between Jim Lee and Dan Didio, I mean, Jim Lee is a little bit, he's more of the go-to comic book guy, quite frankly, in terms of maybe talent, and he's a bigger name. He's a bigger name as an artist than Dan Didio is as a writer, and so I guess that makes sense from that point of view. So maybe this is just more of sort of culling the herd. You don't need to replace them. That's a possibility.
Well, to be honest, I'm sure this shortage of titles isn't going to last. I'm sure that when 5G comes about and is finally in motion, I can almost guarantee you that whatever happens, we're going to get way more books. I mean, every publishing initiative does this, where leading up to, we start cutting the line to make room for the new books to come out of whatever this new initiative is. So I can guarantee you that it's going to be a big push. I think that aside from a publisher, we need a consensus in editorial, because DC has shown a complete and utter lack of this, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of potential there. Obviously, with Rebirth, and I know I keep coming back to it, but it was such a positive time for DC Comics. What about it fell apart? There was a lack of not only editorial control, but the proper relationship between editorial, their superiors, and the creators. Right? Things automatically went off the rails.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be some sort of consensus here on what's going on. I think that editors in comics and being a good editor is a trade that is not taught, is not kind of, it's just not something people are educated on. And coming into this, I think that with this kind of advent of massive adaptation of comic book properties to film, to television, I don't think that they're putting comic book people into these editorial roles. They're putting general entertainment people. And I think that's an issue. Now, could there be somebody coming from another medium into comics that can make a positive impact? Of course. It's happened before. Obviously, Jeff Loeb, say what you want about what happened at the latter half of his comic book career. When he first stepped onto the scene, he was incredible, highly lauded, as well as like Straczynski. JMS is a television guy, right? Like he's known for Babylon. And you came to Marvel and even went to DC and did some very interesting, strong things. So I think that there just needs to be whoever is in control of DC editorial and of the publishing house needs to ultimately have a passion for the universe, and they have to have a concise direction that they want to go.
And I think that and it's worth pointing out, as Spike says, publishers deal in distribution and licenses as a whole. Dan Didio was co-publisher. That is different than an editor-in-chief. I agree with you, Dark Knight. Being an editor-in-chief, you're more focused on what the content's going to be and putting together the talent to create the content so that it can be distributed and licensed. And you're going to encourage, quality content is more likely to be published and licensed and distributed than garbage. Let's face it. And I know I've had a talk with Spike on many an occasion about the lack of quality storytelling and quality comics in the last 10, 15 years, because, the so-called greenbacks, the quality titles that Marvel and DC publishes. I mean, it's pretty sad that Watchmen is still the number one selling graphic novel for DC year in and year out. I mean, at some point, we got to start creating new modern day classics instead of relying on the ones that are 35 years old.
Yeah,
and that's why we need, it's important that we need an editor to cultivate that talent.
No, exactly. And to the same degree, like being an editor, especially in comics, has to be such a fine balance, right? Because you need to know when to let creators and artists and writers have a little bit more control and a little bit more say in what they're doing. And you need to know when to tell them to hold up. That's been the big thing at DC. And we've talked about it on numerous occasions. The biggest issue with DC right now is that they had, well, I guess the last year or two, is that they've had too many architects of their universe. I mean, at one time, we have Scott Snyder doing the Metal and Justice League stuff. We have Tom King, trying to put everybody in therapy and run us into a spiraling hole of depression. We had Jeff Johns doing Doomsday Clock, which never came out. We have Bendis doing his thing. That doesn't work. You can have talented creators working in a direction that they favor, but its level of impact on the overall scheme of things has to vary. There has to be a consensus. And the best periods in comics show that for any publisher, whether it's Marvel, DC, or whoever. So ultimately, obviously, what needs to happen moving forward is we need to strengthen editorial. And I think that we need to start putting stories first over spectacle. Because you look at Bendis, he's putting spectacle first over story. Yeah. Let's reveal Superman's identity. Why doesn't that work? I mean, I don't think it works on a level for the character, because I think it deprives Superman of an aspect of his humanity and his human experience that is very important in being Clark Kent. But also, we just gave him his secret identity back like 3-4 years ago. So it's very clear that those types of decisions are being made based on spectacle. What happens to DC when we're making decisions based on story? Well, I mean, Jonathan Kent has quickly become one of the most popular characters at DC. Why? He was a story-based decision. We decided to progress Superman's development. We decided to challenge the character in a new way that also pays respect to who this character is, right? Down to the core.
Yeah.
And they benefited from it. John Kent, I mean, we had a conversation last week about drafting Marvel creators to DC. And to be honest, no matter what we were talking about, there was always multiple people in the chat talking about Jonathan Kent, even though it had nothing to do with what we were saying. And that's a testament to how strong that character was. Why? It was a character-based decision. And
Dark Knight, I'm gonna have you continue to talk. I know there's 28 people in the stream. I gotta quickly run and grab something, but keep on talking. You can.
Yeah, and so one important thing to obviously be conscious of, guys, right, is that no matter what happens at DC, somebody's always going to disagree. I'm sure for the 28 people of us that are here discussing our thoughts on what's going on, there's probably going to be 28 different opinions on what DC should be doing moving forward. I think. Yeah, I think the important thing to take note of, along with what Comic Boom has said, and Spike saying it in the chat, is that, we're not creating these evergreen stories that are going to be looked at as classics. Stories from the 80s, like Spike is saying, are highly outselling current comics. And we need to create an air of importance and urgency around our current mainline books, because that's the only way we can keep this industry moving forward. Otherwise, all people are going to be looking at are the Watchmens, the Dark Knight Returns, so on and so forth. And ultimately, there needs to be a push for story over character. Things like, story over spectacle. ultimately what Bendis is doing at DC doesn't last. Why? Because he's not doing it in the best interest of the character. He's doing it in, whatever interests he might have about maybe creating characters for royalty, or just trying to, create an immediate pop of sale by, outing Superman's identity for like the 12th time, which I don't know why anybody decided to tune into that. And I think another big issue is that the market is also fueled by speculation regarding first appearances and, whether or not this thing is going to become valuable. And I think that has ultimately happened because the progressive stories have stopped becoming interesting enough for speculators and fans to pick up books based on the merits of those stories rather than what they think is going to be valuable. Ultimately, people need to be put in positions of creative authority that are innovative and are ready to tell those types of stories and even take risks. I think that as fans, even though, we're not all going to have the same taste, people do need to take risks with these IPs and these characters. And that's the only way we're going to be able to move forward. But boom, I was just talking about basically how I think one of the biggest issues is that contemporary stories aren't driving the market anymore because they're not interesting enough. That, I know you, for example, are a speculator, and a lot of people buy comics based on first appearances or issue number ones or whatever. And I think that is partly a product because contemporary stories haven't been interesting enough to drive the market to the point where people are looking for other excuses to buy these books, and that's speculation, which is unfortunate because if that weren't the case, then issue number 44 of the Green Lantern would be outselling whatever because it's a great story and not because it has the first appearance of the 1957th Earth Green Lantern.
Yeah. Quality stories are a problem. And a quick note, I just got here and I saw Spike's comment about it's bad. Good classic comics from the 80s are still top sellers today, and that's very true. Why are these speculators? I mean, I always get a kick out of, I see all these speculators online, and I'm one of them, by the way. So I'm pointing a finger right at myself. So I'm not pointing a finger. I got 3 pointing right back at me. So I'm just as guilty. But we, like you said, we talk about first appearances, or the first time somebody farted in a comic, like, oh wow, it goes up $10. Like
somebody's penis appears.
Yeah, I mean, give me a break. I mean, but do you actually know what the content of the story was?
Right.
I mean, a lot of them don't actually. I know they read the comics, but nobody talks really about the stories themselves, and it's really, really sad. And it's very rare when you talk among speculators. When I wear my speculator hat, I don't often talk about story content, and I even got into a debate with one guy, who's a nice guy, on my channel, or I commented on Simple Man's Comics, which is a great YouTube channel. I encourage people to go check out Simple Man's Comics.
I'll be back in 2 seconds, okay?
Yeah, and then, anyways, the comment that I made on Simple Man's Comics was that I was talking about speculation, and I thought that Batman 89 is a good spec book right now because of the appearance of Punchline. But I thought, well, Aquaman and Mira's daughter is also in Aquaman issue 57 out this week. So if you're specking, I'm thinking that's a reasonable, good spec book, potentially as good as Punchline and Batman 89, but less. It's likely going to be not as big, but it is Aquaman and Mira's daughter, and very few people are talking about it. And it's a better written story by Kelly Sue DeConnick than Batman 89 was, if you want to talk story over the actual event itself. And that's sort of part of I think that's, it's one of those things where I think spec down the road, the birth of a character of Aquaman and Mira's daughter could have impact spec-wise, story-wise, down the road, more so than some of these other spec books. But I digress somewhat. But it is an issue that, when characters are introduced, or when writers introduce new characters just for I get the impression that a lot of writers do that. They'll introduce a new character just to create hype as opposed to building on existing popular characters. You see this a lot, and it's frustrating to me, that you've got characters, that you've got this vast amount of characters to choose from in the DC wheelhouse, and there's no reason why you can't write better stories with them. And the inclination is always to sometimes, I think, sometimes to look outside a house when you don't need to. You got all this incredible material in the house, but there's not enough passion or knowledge about the characters in DC right now. And it's pretty hard to captivate a new audience when the existing writers aren't familiar enough with the house that they're writing stories for.
I totally agree. I mean, and there's a one word answer, I think, to what you're positing here, and that's royalties. I mean, simply people are creating characters because they know they'll get a little dip if anybody else plays with their toy. Which, if you're going to create a new character, there should be a story reason. There should be something that your character is adding to the universe. And for me, if I were in a position to play in, a DC or a Marvel sandbox, I think primarily, obviously, unless I was like so strapped for cash, which clearly Bendis isn't, I would play with characters that already exist that don't get enough love. I mean, some of my favorite things in comics are when people take C or D list characters and make something of them. I mean, I've talked about it in our previous streams in the past. In New 52 Detective Comics, when they took Wrath. You know what I'm talking about? He's like a mirror Batman, essentially.
Right. Wraith. Marvel did that, right? Wraith?
No. DC in Detective Comics.
Oh, Wrath. Wasn't that the Batman who had the opposite origin? He became
I mean, he was a D-list character that nobody cared about, and then in that run of Detective Comics, like, made him one of Batman's most fearsome villains.
And he premiered in an annual. He premiered, I think, in Batman Annual. Anyways, back in the day.
But yeah, I mean, he went from being a D-list garbage villain to being somebody who clearly challenged Batman in a way, other characters wouldn't. So, for me, I think there's such an appeal to taking those characters and update them, and to make them applicable to our current kind of atmosphere and our current logic. There are a lot of great characters out there.
It was Batman Special by Mike Barr. Jace Millam indicated that Wraith was premiered in DC Batman Special by Mike Barr.
Yeah, but like, you get what I'm saying here, right? Like,
sure, of course it is.
There are a lot of really corny characters that could definitely serve to be updated and reinvented. And people are more interested in making royalties. And obviously, if people didn't create new characters, we wouldn't have gotten. I mean, technically, we wouldn't have gotten anybody, because at some point, every character in comics was new. But I think that there's such a massive, sandbox for people to play in. Why not use those characters? And again, I think part of it is because, these big companies obviously won't reimburse you in the same way that they would if you created a new successful character, right? I mean, in my opinion, I think that in continuity, some creators have made certain contributions that are to some characters that are ultimately a massive improvement on what they were when they came out. I mean, when Hal Jordan came out, obviously, like, the idea for him is great, but he wasn't anything spectacular. To me, Jeff Johns is credited for everything I know about Hal Jordan. So, I think that there should be a little bit more of an incentive for these creators to play in the sandbox and to reevaluate some of these characters.
I think Spike makes a good point. He says readers and collectors are diversifying, he thinks, because of a lack of quality and respect. And he makes the point that the back issue market has actually grown, and that hasn't happened since the 1960s. That's a very interesting point. I never really thought of it that way, that if we, I mean, actually it does make sense, because I have bought more indie comics in the last 10 years than I ever have ever. And it's not because of the growth of the indie market. It's because I'm getting very upset and tired of the same old tried out storylines from DC and Marvel. And quite frankly, I'm buying less trades than I ever have before from DC and Marvel. And that's exactly right. And I think Spike makes a good point. And if the back issue market is growing, that's consistent with Dan Didio's earlier comments that he made a couple months ago about Dan Didio expressed frustrations that, they would publish, if they publish first appearances, it sells more comics than their mainstream line.
Yeah.
When they republish their comic books from 20, 25, 30 years ago, and they sell more than the current Batman or the current issue of their middle of the road line, that's really telling you something that people, who's the market, like what market are they actually going for here? And because something here, and this is another point to be made, and I'll make it quick, and that is that, is the comic book market really growing? Because it really seems to be growing in spits and in fits and bounds, and it's incremental, the growth. It's like every time DC and Marvel, when one sells more than the other, it's like that 5% of the market shifts from DC back to Marvel, from DC back to Marvel, with Marvel always slightly winning the unit share and market share. It's nonsense.
Yeah, there's a big thing that I think one of the big issues here is that comic book publishers are in general, like the publisher, not like the position, but like the organization is more concerned on immediate sales than they are on long term. They don't make long term decisions, and it's very clear based on the whole initiative to, for example, Marvel's constant rebooting to resetting to number ones, or DC doing these spectaculars. Let's be real. These spectaculars and these celebrations of characters aren't celebrations. They're because they've noticed how well DC Comic or Detective Comics 1000 and Action Comic 1000 sold. They're looking at least incrementally or fractionally to reinvigorate that level of sale, which is unfortunate because they should be doing it in tribute to the characters, and that should be the motivation. And the issue is that they're not willing to plan long-term and to see incremental growth. They want to see spikes. And when you have spikes in sales, you're going to go down. You can't maintain that. But if you're making consistent growth through quality of stories, right? Because eventually what will happen is those stories become higher in quality. People go back. They'll buy those trades. People who buy those trades are going to think, wow, gee, what's going on in comics within like this immediate frame of time is interesting. Let me get into buying the periodical comics, which is what happened to me. That's how I got into comics, right? Like I read Grant Morrison's Batman and things along that nature. And then somebody was like, man, you should read this Court of Owls thing. And for me, I picked up Court of Owls and just soaked up Court of Owls, City of Owls, Death of the Family. And then I was like, I caught up to continuity. So that's when I started buying floppies. That's how you get fans in here.
Well, that's also an example of a greenback title that is quality, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's a set number of issues. It's like a span of 3 or 4 trades, and it's done right. It's done very well. And unfortunately, I don't know what the heck is wrong with so many of the writers when they go to DC or Marvel, but this nonsense of having 100 issue, 85 issue Batman runs or 39 issue Justice League runs that don't have an ending, like Scott Snyder. I mean, he had a winning formula with Court of Owls. I mean, you have to have a concept of an ending, and you have to finish it.
Well, and I agree. There should be an ending in mind, and there does need to be that kind of tightness to what's being written.
There just isn't. There's no tightness right now in comics. And the next editor in chief, or okay, I know Dan Didio was just a publisher, but we're sort of delving off topic a little bit here because he was a publisher, but it's related to the publishing in terms of quality. They got to reel in their storylines, and they've got to tighten them up. And they have to have more satisfying endings that are character driven. Like you said, I mean, you said before that the spectacle over story is such a problem.
Mhm.
And not only is the spectacle over story, when they do have a story, it's plot centric. It's not character focused.
And
That's the sad part. Like with Bendis, Bendis isn't writing Superman very well. He's focusing on the plot of, oh, he's got his secret identity revealed. Look how exciting this is. It's not exciting. He just revealed his secret identity. What's exciting about that?
yeah,
And
he just got it back.
what's exciting about that? That's spectacle over story. The story's boring as hell.
Well,
Now Superman doesn't even now Clark doesn't even wear glasses anymore. So now Clark Kent looks like Superman, but he wears his glasses anyway because Bendis. Like, it's just nonsense. Where's the story?
Well, I think to a degree, which is unfortunate, is that now fans have become so accustomed to it, they fall into the trap of buying for spectacle. I don't think people are kind of mentally trying to like meditate on what's going on and take a step back and reevaluate what they're purchasing. I mean, for example, and I'll be publishing a video by tomorrow about what I'm thinking about James Tynion Batman so far. You know what the biggest thing people are talking about? All the new toys that they're introducing in Batman. Is it cool? Yes.
Yeah.
But when a new writer hops on something as big as Batman, the biggest highlight shouldn't be Batman playing with new toys. I'm sorry. It should be what you're doing with the character, what the story is, how Batman is going to get out of this situation. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like that is a huge, huge issue, is that everybody's talking about Batman's new toys. Mm. Why aren't we talking about how Batman's going to get out of this situation? Why aren't we talking about how this is going to affect the character or Gotham City?
Yeah.
And I'm not trashing on it. It's an okay run. I don't dislike it, but yeah. The issue is that we've conditioned the reader into buying for spectacle. And that's an issue, because even me, even myself, for someone who talks like this, and I tend to be very good at just trying to buy good stories or stories that have a lot of care in them. I'm not going near death metal or metal 2, whatever the hell you want to call it. But I'm not going to lie. When I saw Batman with a scythe on a fucking bone motorcycle, I was like, that's rad. That looks cool. Like, for a split second, I was like, oh, I can't wait to see that. And I had to step back and think to myself, no, I'm not buying this, because I know it's for spectacle and it's not a story-based decision. So I think that, as comic book readers, if we want to see change, we need to be part of that change. We need to be advocates of making sure that people are not investing their money because of spectacle and just because of, character loyalty or standing. I don't know if everybody knows the term a stan, but like standing a writer or standing an artist, right? Like for me, I think that being a stan for a character or a writer or an artist is just as bad as being a hater. Because if somebody's doing something that you don't like and you continue to buy it, what is that saying? What is that saying to the publisher? It's saying that no matter what this person does, no matter how bad it is or how good it is or whatever the varying quality is, you're still going to buy it because their name is on it. And that's why they give Bendis so much control, right? Because he's established a name. And that if Bendis, for the most part, it seems like it's starting to die down. But if Bendis comes onto a new book, somebody's going to buy it because it's Bendis, even though the quality has definitely not been good. So, I urge people to speak with their money, and it's hard. It's very hard. I know. It took me 60 issues of Tom King's Batman to finally drop it.
Yeah.
Mind you, I didn't hate it the whole way through. I started hating it like 3 arcs in. But like
the thing is, but it fosters resentment. It fosters resentment when you don't have a choice. And I've said this before, and I said this before in our last live stream, that realistically for somebody, it's not possible to avoid death metal. If it really is not possible, if you're a DC fan, if you like any part of DC Comics and you're even remotely curious about 5G, you want to know how the heck it's going to be formed. You want to know what's leading up to it. So it's really, really hard to avoid. It is.
You can always go back.
Well, you're not going to do that, but it's 6 issues. You almost got to get it. And well, no, you can say no, but the reality is that you're going to know about it anyway. You're going to find out about it anyway. We're going to have live streams about it. You're going to find out. And then you're going to find out if there's something after it that comes out that you don't like, you're going to be confused. And then you're going to end up reading about it anyway, or reading an article about it. And the way that they went about this, and this is part of editorial, is that, and this goes back to what DC's got to do. They got to right the ship. You don't want to foster that kind of resentment, because it's like you're playing ping pong with your readership, and it's not right, and it's not fair, and it's very, very frustrating, because I have an addiction problem, and I'm codependent.
Yeah, but that's the thing, man. Like, thinking that way is just going to enable these publishers to make these decisions that you don't necessarily like. For me, again, it doesn't mean that I can't eventually buy death metal. The biggest thing is that I don't contribute to the direct market and pre-order or buy the book straight off the shelves so that it gets the reprint. I can buy it later, and likely for cheaper, right? Because a lot of these modern comics aren't maintaining or increasing in value regardless, right?
Yeah.
And to be honest, like, I'll get the bare bones coverage via news sites. So for me, I'm more interested in making that statement. Do I love Scott Snyder? Yes. Do I love Greg Capullo? Yes. Do I have confidence in the direction they're going in? Absolutely not. No.
All right. Well, I'm going to, we're at 2 hours and 15 minutes. I want to shut this down. I got to binge watch with the wife. We can all say a prayer tonight for Dan Didio. He can rest and relax on the millions he earned during his 18-year tenure with DC Comics. But I want to thank everybody in the chat. We at one point I think we had like 30-some people in the chat. It was just incredible. Thank you, everyone who showed up in the chat. You all know who you are. I tried to put a lot of your comments live on the screen. So thank you to everybody, and thank you to Dark Knight Nation. Check out Dark Knight Nation's channel. It's a great channel. He's just starting to come back from his studies. He's going to be doing more content. And you got anything coming up in the next week or so, Dark Knight?
Oh yeah. So well, I mean, thank you first and foremost for having me and being prepared to have this impromptu conversation. By tomorrow I will have my review and analysis of James Tynan's Batman run so far from 86 to 89. What I think he's doing right, what I think he could improve upon. And on Sunday, I believe we're going to be doing a follow-up to the stream that we did on your channel last weekend, where we drafted Marvel creators to DC. Now, on my channel on Sunday, you guys can tune in at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I think, right? Or is it 5? Is it 5 my time? Are we doing 3 p.m. your time, 5 my time?
You're 2 hours ahead of me, so yeah, that would be it.
So 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be drafting Marvel creators to DC, which I think is going to be an inherently more difficult task, because I think Marvel has better creators currently than DC does. So that'll be fun. And then sometime within the next week, I will be also giving my kind of analytical critique on Donny Cates and Nick Klein's current Thor run from issues 1 through 3. So that'll be really fun. So if you guys decide to pop over to my channel, link is in the description, and it'd be great to see you guys there.
Okay. Sorry. Anything else?
No, that's about it, man. Thank you everybody for tuning in and watching and giving their thoughts. It's always great to engage with you guys and to get, opinions beyond, of course, just ours. And boom, thanks for sitting down and having a great conversation as always.
For sure. I'm going to be doing a live stream tomorrow with Tevla Soka. I guest on his channel. We'll be talking about DC Generation 1 through 5. I'm not sure how that's going to go. And then, of course, again, DC Dark Knight, you and I will do another live stream on our picks for the DC picks for Marvel, which that might be fun. In any event, guys, thanks for watching. I am out of here. Dark Knight, thanks. Dan Didio, don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Don't worry, we'll ship your desk. You don't have to come back Monday. Don't worry about it. Jim Lee will haul the stuff in a van. Jeff Johns will happily come. He's got your corner office all nicely. It's just fantastic, Dan. Just relax. Get drunk. It's okay. 18 years, man. Let's face it. No one cares. Anyways, that's my rant, my bitching, guys. Yes, we do. We need more rants, Big Manny, Bag Manny. Yes, we do. Bag, yes, we do, and you'll get those. All right, guys, and I'm just gonna put a couple. Thanks, Tim. Guys, check out Tim Board. He's on Twitter. He's the all things Hawkman. He's got a cool symbol there that you see. It's awesome. And also, I want to give a shout out to Spike Valentine, Jace Mallon. Thanks, NYW Geeks. So many of you on the chat here. I'm gonna miss you. I'm gonna miss some. I apologize. David Dicer, Janvier Montano. My God. There's Drakenslayer Silverclaw. That is a mouthful, but he's got some cool comments. Solar Rebirth. Thanks everything, guys. We'll catch you later. See you, Dark Knight.
See you guys. Have a good night.